Hello, I'm Lynn Olson, a senior fellow at Future Ed and the author of the report, Teachers Like Us, Strategies for Increasing Educator Diversity in Public Schools. A host of studies have found that when students of color have teachers of color, their attendance improves, disciplinary infractions declines. A diverse teaching force benefits all students, improving attitudes about race and young people's sense of self-efficacy. Yet while students of color comprise more than 50% of public school enrollment nationally, nearly 80% of teachers are white. In many states, most students attend schools and districts that do not employ a single teacher of color. Why should this be, and what can we do about it? To talk about this issue, I'm joined by four people who are leaders in recruiting, preparing, and retaining more teachers of color in the nation's classrooms. Tequilla Brownie, CEO of TNTP, Sharif El-Mekki, CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development, Mayme Hostetter, President of Relay Graduate School of Education, and Tami Jenkins, Program Director for Tech Teach across Texas. Welcome to the webinar. Tequilla, let's start with you to get the big picture. What are the main reasons we don't have more teachers of color in the nation's classrooms?
Hi, Lynn. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I would say there are a couple of reasons that we are facing this problem. And I want to be clear, some people ask, is it a pipeline problem or is it a retention problem? And the truth of the matter is that it's both. We don't have enough candidates entering the profession that are teachers of color, and we aren't retaining those that are in the profession at the rates that we need to. One of the things that I'll say is that, to your point about the data, in 97% of our school districts around the country, the percentage of students of color exceeds the percentage of teachers of color. And so I like to tell people to be very pragmatic. It's not like we're flying in students of color from Mars. So that means that our adult population, our workforce, is more diverse. So that means we actually have a larger pool of potential candidates. We simply are not making the policy and practice and prioritizations in order to change that trajectory. And as you said, this is not about a values or moral obligation conversation. It's not simply that, even though I will be the first to say, yes, children should be able to see people that look like them in the classroom, but irrespective of where you stand sort of from that moral imperative, look at the data. The data are unassailable and unambiguous. All students benefit from having a more diverse teacher force, particularly students of color. So my question is, if you actually care about outcomes for kids, then this should be a priority that you are addressing both in the pipeline as well as in how we're retaining teachers.
And Sharif, the Center for Black Educator Development focuses on recruiting, training, and retaining teachers of color, and starts early, starts in high school. Could you talk about why you start in high school and how you support those students early on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a couple of reasons, and I'll try to get to them briefly. One, the youth are leaders, and we look at teaching as leadership. We look at leading a classroom, and when we describe it as such, it really piques their interest, for students to understand that, oh, that is a leadership role, civic as well as within a school or a district. It's community leadership. And, sometimes we would do these why I teach tours, and many students, the first question is, how many people are thinking about being teachers? And few would raise their hands. But when we start asking, how many of you have been looked at as a leader? How many of you have supported a peer or someone younger? How many of you have given advice that even elders respect and honor? And each time more and more, hands were raised. And when we asked them who considers themselves, someone who's going to give back to the community and is interested in social justice, most of them raise their hand. And we say, okay, these are parts of what leading a classroom looks like. And, they're like, we never thought of it that way. But we're also really pushing and challenging, school and district leaders to look at talent differently. Often when we talk to them, they're thinking talent is someone that has a bachelor's degree already. And we say, no, your talent is actually sitting in front of you. And you can't continue to, it's like, oh yes, we want to diversify our teacher workforce. And when we ask them like, okay, how are you investing? They talk about teacher fairs and I was like, okay, so you invested in a table skirt and some pens to give out and try to convince strangers to come to your district. Bad choice, to make that your flag bearing, recruitment strategy. Look at talent as because you can't ignore these high school youth who may be interested and need, just to be able to experience it differently. And so how we support them is really in three ways. Our pathways is one, teacher academy. So imagine in high school, you're able to take a course as you're matriculating through high school. And our goal is for high school students who are interested in teaching and take the necessary coursework to graduate high school with an associate's degree in education and a paraprofessional certificate. We believe one, that just whets their appetite, but gives them experiences. But that early exposure is tied to clinical experiences. So out of school time, after school and summer, we offer paid apprenticeships where they're actually teaching first, second, and third graders while they're in high school, as well as college, and they're supported by our staff and mentors. So we have those in a couple of cities, as well as a virtual option. So we're actually hoping we get some Texas Tech, students, involved this summer in our virtual program. And then lastly, out of those, if you participate in that, you're able to apply to our Future Black Teachers of Excellence Fund. We've been raising money to support. And this is for Black Teacher Pipeline Fellows, which is in partnership with the United Negro College Fund. Students who are Black Teacher Pipeline Fellows get last dollar scholarship support. So imagine they've already gotten an associate's degree, but then they also get financial support in college. But when they get to their 5th year of teaching, there's a retention bonus, regardless of the collective bargaining agreement or where they teach. If they're in our partnering cities, that's what they are eligible to receive. So that's how we're supporting.
Great, Sharif, that brings me to my next question, which is, for many prospective teachers of color, one of the biggest barriers is the financial cost of going to college and of earning a teaching degree, particularly if they come from low wealth communities. I'd love any of the panelists to talk about, we're seeing federal and state scholarship and grant programs. Are we doing enough? And if not, what more do you think needs to be done in this regard?
I'll jump in first and would love for others. The first thing, I think one of the mistakes that we've made as a sector, Lynn, is we think about teaching, people talk about it only as this calling. And now to be clear, I do think that yes, great teachers are literally called, which we would hope any profession, medicine, doctors, nurses, right, that they are called. People are called to work in a career that doesn't feel like, it's a labor of love, frankly. Mm-hmm. But teaching, if we approached it as a job, as a workforce issue, I think some of our strategies and approaches would be different. And what I mean by that is, to your point, how can we in good conscience push children, especially children who are coming from poverty, first-gen college students, like myself, to go into a career that the cap of, from how much they can make is pretty low relative to other professions. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's that trade-off, that value proposition is not there. One of the things, though, this is why I think about one of the things that we noticed over time, some people say it's an intended consequence, some say unintended. After we, desegregated schools, we did see in our nation, we lost thousands of African-American and Black educators as a byproduct of Brown versus Board of Ed. But what's interesting, I think this is an opportunity for us to sort of right some of those issues and we view it as a workforce issue. It's frankly an opportunity for a 2-gen strategy. Many of the very families and parents of our students, they are working in jobs that are in the gig economy, no benefits, no full-time. And so while teaching may not be a lucrative career for some of the families and relatives of our students, it sure beats a part-time gig job. And so it has an immediate impact of, yes, increasing the diversity of our teachers in the short term, and it has an immediate impact, economic impact on that family. And so when I think about can we do more, I actually think looking at this as a true job from a workforce perspective, that's how you unlock other dollars through apprenticeship, through Department of Labor, instead of just K-12 on its own by itself trying to tackle this problem. In my community, and most of us, if there's a big employer, if that employer has a shortage of workers, it's not the CEO of that company that's on the news trying to like rally the troops to get a workforce. It's the chamber, it's the mayor, it's the whole community rallying. And I don't understand why more communities don't see the teacher shortage as a workforce issue for its community, not just an isolated K-12 problem. That's how we unleash collaboration, the dollars, the stipends, right? The housing subsidies, all those other resources that could help unlock this wicked problem.
Mayme or Tami, I know you've seen this close up with the students who attend your programs. Do you want to sort of weigh in on this question?
Yeah, just to briefly agree with everything that Tequilla just said. I think especially when we're talking about diversifying the teacher profession, we have to be talking about changing the return on investment at the same time. Those have to go hand in hand. So whether you're talking about raising the salary floor or forgiving student loans to teachers or reducing teacher taxes, all of it. I'm for all of it. We especially have to be thinking about all of that if we're serious about bringing in more Black and brown teachers to the profession.
Yeah, and Sharif, you mentioned it's not just a district issue, it really is a sort of regional and state and federal issue. Tami, what's your own experience of how your students experience the financial costs of all this?
I think for our students, some of the challenges that they have are tied to some of the state requirements. So I'd love to see some of those certification exams at the state levels, having those fees just waived altogether. They become a detriment to students. Here in Texas, we have the option for students to take that exam 5 times. But when you think about the cost that's associated with that for students that are already in struggling to make ends meet, that becomes a challenge. So I agree with everything that everyone has said. I do think that it's more about providing opportunities and federal dollars to alleviate some of the cost and concerns that come along with becoming educators. And I don't think that that's a weight that all students should have to carry on their own.
And we'll come back to the licensing question in a second, but you know, the other thing that I heard as I was working on this report was that in many ways, schools of education may mirror the schools that students attended, and that they're not necessarily welcome and inclusive places for prospective teachers of color. I would love, Mayme, for you to talk about how teacher prep programs might need to change in order to both recruit and graduate more candidates of color, and talk a little about how Relay has approached that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Lynn. I want to talk briefly about 3 factors here. First, the diversity of the faculty in teacher prep programs. Second, the cost of those programs. And then third, the partners that those programs are working with. Faculty diversity matters just like teacher diversity matters. The Teachers Like Us brief was very clear on this front. We've got less than 10% of teacher prep faculty in this country identifying as people of color. At Relay, 64% of our faculty are people of color, and that really matters for our students. And to Tequilla's point, it matters especially for our aspiring teachers of color, but it's better for all of our graduate students at Relay to see a truly representative faculty, folks embodying the real exemplars of the profession, being a diverse group from the moment someone steps into Relay's halls. That is really important, and I think it should be a major focus for teacher prep broadly in this country. Secondly, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, program costs really matter, particularly for students who are more likely to bear a higher debt load. And we know that it is our Black and brown students who are more likely to bear a higher debt load. So we do our best at Relay to keep quality high and costs low for our graduate students. One of the ways we do that, we run the largest residency program in our country, over 1,000 residents this year, in part because we believe that people should be able to learn while they earn. They shouldn't have to leave the labor market or forego a salary in order to be learning how to be great teachers. We also do our best to keep our overall program costs as low as possible. We've got the lowest graduate debt load of any master's level teacher prep program in the country, which allows our students to see just a faster return on their investment in high quality preparation earlier on in their career. And so focusing on those two things, programs that allow folks to earn while they learn and keeping overall program costs low, are really important when we think about diversifying the profession. And then just last, but certainly not least, schools of education, we're often in partnership. We need to be in partnership with the school districts, the CMOs, the peer organizations in our communities. And we need to be choosing those partners based on their demonstrated commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Who's on the school board? Who's on the leadership team? How have they been contributing, not just right now, but historically, to diversifying the profession, and outside of the more school boards, school district partners, the partners who you work with in your communities, like we've been working with Sharif for many years now in Philly because of his demonstrable commitment to ensuring more Black men in particular join and thrive in this profession. So those are the types of partners we look for wherever we go. And I think teacher prep programs need to be thinking about that partnership approach as well. So faculty diversity, cost of program, and partners who are committed.
Great. And we have a question from the audience, which is, when we talked earlier about return on investment in teacher salary, they wondered, how do we do a better job explaining the teacher salary structure? Students tend to see teaching as a low-paying job, particularly given the starting salaries, but in some places, the salaries are good. So would love anybody to jump in on that.
Yeah, one of the things that we that's a great question, Lynn, because some of this is like we do this to ourselves, right? We as a sector, we talk about how horrible it is and oh my God, teaching and sort of all the negatives to it. And I think putting it in context, which is where I mentioned, like thinking of it as a workforce issue. If a region, a community, right, sort of could talk about all of its top employers, generally the school district is or education as a sector is towards the top. And if you rank order and look at sort of starting average salaries, it doesn't come out at the bottom, right? A lot of these part-time gigs, service industry jobs are all way lower than teaching. So again, relatively speaking, in a region, teaching, again, not lucrative, but it is, it is better than some other options. I want to be clear about that. The other thing I think how to help folks understand, and we're actually pushing districts to really revisit their employee value proposition, right? Like, some of our teachers, as Sharif said, they come in, some of the younger, newer teachers are coming to the work seeing it more as a social justice issue, not like okay, I'm here, this is my 30-year pension job. And so rethinking and revisiting your total rewards is something that we've pushed districts to look at innovating in, because it helps you sort of tap into the different motivations on why certain people choose teaching as a career versus not.
Yeah, and I would just add to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sharif.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we speak about this with our high school students often. And, first thing, we really want them to just always be critical thinkers. And we're just like, well, where did you get that from? They're like, oh, I heard it. It's just like, okay, for which city, which region, because these matter, right? And so, we really try to help them see like, hey, sometimes average is the wrong thing to take a look at. And you have to look at the context of where you are, what that salary range is. And then also not just look at the starting salary, but also look at career lattices, what educational landscape actually looks like. And we say like, hey, what are all the different roles that you recognize? They're not all teachers. You should definitely want to start as that, because that gives you the strongest context, and that's where you're closest to students and making the impact. but then we just share, like, here's what an ecosystem of education practitioners looks like. Here's what your region, that you want to be in looks like. And then we also just share, like, hey, advocacy will continue. So, one of our partners is the Teacher Salary Project, where we're, going to continue to work with them to advocate for higher salaries. And we see some of this conversation happening at local as well as the federal level.
And we are seeing many states and districts create grow your own programs to recruit and train teachers of color from the local community, including high school students, paraprofessionals, after-school workers. Well, I know TNTP worked with a number of districts to create the Black Educator Excellence Cohort. What was the impact of that, and what did you find was most important in terms of actually sort of making a difference?
Yeah, so I love our program, Black Educator Excellence Cohort. It sort of came out of our Grow Your Own strategy, which was, to your point, it was really about getting to adults earlier, including high school students, paraprofessionals, because if you look at the race of our paraprofessionals and those that are proximate to students but not certified teachers, the demographics match or mirror the demographics of the students way more so. And so when we get them into the teaching profession, it's not culture shock. They're already acclimated and in proximity to the students. They are, frankly, from the community of our students. So what we did with that Black Educator Excellence Cohort was actually try to remove and tackle some of the barriers that we know exist that were keeping Black teachers out of the profession. We did targeted financial aid, to Tami's point about some of the testing and all the certification and requirements. We did a network of mutual supports, because one of the things we've also heard is sort of, people refer to it as sort of the Black tax, right? When a teacher in isolation and goes into a school and they are the one, candidate of color or teacher of color. So we actually have a cohort model where they're actually going in together with a group of peers to help them continue their training and their placement. And our early outcomes have been promising. We've been able to place, just in a couple of years, over 500 new teachers who have reached over 20,000 students. And those teachers, like 97%, which, this is better than our traditional models, have told us that they felt prepared for the classroom. And 2/3 saying that they know they would not have completed the program, their training, without having the support of the program. And so it's programs like that. We've also done one with the Latinx community. I called our Parent Educator Academy. It's also a free training program that helps participants. It started out helping parents be better advocates, but it ends up being sort of a similar to the Black Educator Excellence Cohort, where it's a pipeline for families to receive training and consider teaching as a career in their future as well.
And Mayme and Tami, I know people often think about teacher residencies like relays and Texas Tech as sort of the gold standard right now in teacher preparation, because students get a really rich supported clinical experience while they're going through their coursework and are able to get a stipend or some salary while they're learning. At the same time, the programs can still be inaccessible to many candidates, again, because of cost, because of location. I wonder about, how both of your programs think about taking and scaling that model in a way that really makes it accessible to the students we're trying to serve.
So I think one of the things that Texas Tech has done that I think has been the most beneficial to teachers of color is we are going to them. So we're not just expecting that they will come to us. We're offering them the opportunity to become an educator in 1 year after they complete their associate's degree. So Sharif, bring them on, we'll take them. And then once they're with us for a year, they complete that year and they've earned their bachelor's degree and their certification. So the community college has really served as a catalyst for us to tap into a market of students that normally would not have access to a university educator prep program of this quality. And, you know, some of the things that we've all shared here, the support mechanisms that are in place, they have to have that cohort model that not only supports where they're not only receiving support from each other, but they're also receiving support from someone else who preferably looks like them, but also has some experience with the districts and has that partnership built in with those districts that we're working with. We have a lot of conversations with districts about how we retain these students. And to everyone's point here, the idea of making salaries one of those things that does not become a barrier for them. So they're receiving a lot of information about what the salaries will look like, what you're eligible for, what certifications you should kind of gear yourself toward to earn different types of salaries. And then I think the other big piece that tech has done is really supporting students with that certification process has to be a critical piece of their prep program. Our students don't typically come in with the content knowledge that they need in order to pass these exams. So we have to build a core curriculum around them that supports them in that process. And I'm very happy to say that over the years, with some trial and effort, we've had 97, 95% passing rates. And that's amazing. It's in 1 year to be able to do that for them, and completely changes their lives. It changes, as Tequilla said, like their expectations for taking a part-time job, that's off the table. In 1 year, they're able to actually earn a salary that changes their lives and the lives of their families.
Tami, I want to jump on that and then maybe come back a little bit to this question, just because you raised the licensure question again. And we know that's proven a barrier for many teachers, particularly teachers of color, who tend to fail those exams at higher rates, end up taking them multiple times, which both entails cost and additional preparation. In response, some states have lowered or eliminated requirements that prospective teachers pass such exams. A question for all of you, is this the right or the wrong solution? How should we be thinking about these licensure tests?
I mean, I'll dive in here first. I mean, the truth of the matter is that state licensure tests have proven to be another barrier for prospective teachers of color who the data show fail these tests at higher rates than other candidates. Now, in response, there are some states that have either lowered or eliminated requirements that prospective teachers pass such exams. And so one of the things I want to acknowledge that I do think that it's definitely part of the solution to revisit it, because if you have a policy, it should be yielding your expected results. Because our research shows, I actually used to lead teacher talent and effectiveness in Memphis before coming to TNTP. And in our district, but also across the country, we did not see not consistent correlation between teachers' performance on the licensure test and their effectiveness in their work in the classroom. And so because of that, because we know it's keeping out an overwhelming number of teachers, disproportionately teachers of colors, and doesn't yield a consistent correlation, to me, it makes you have to question, is that the right bar? Because it's not as reliable that we would, that I think, we would want to have. One teacher, we've had teachers on our blog and different things say that, passing the praxis or some of these exams means you're book smart, but it doesn't actually mean that you can actually reach your students now. And are we saying that there should be no bar? We're not necessarily saying that, but we are saying that we know from experience in working with states that even before COVID, that eliminated tests or reduced some of the barriers. Some of those, they waived some of the requirements. They allowed schools to hire full-time teachers for multiple years, giving them more time. We've seen some innovations that aren't that radical, and we've seen some of that pay off, including during COVID. And we're also working with states now to look at where they actually made waivers available. Did that result in an equally effective but more diverse teacher workforce? The last thing that I'll say, one of the things that's interesting to note about licensure, I know there was a lot of scurry when some of the states were looking at, oh, anybody just come teach, like calling for the military. What is interesting about that, and I do want to your point, clarify, make sure people have the right data. There is something that's called the Interstate Teacher Mobility Compact. That coalition or that initiative actually started out as an effort by the Department of Defense to help the spouses of some of our military personnel have better licensure reciprocity as they were stationed around the country. So it didn't say no licensure or no bar, it just simply made it easier, much like other professions. If you're a doctor in Utah, it's not 1,000 hoops you have to jump through to become a doctor, in the next state. And so that program has been expanded to include any fully licensed teacher who has a bachelor's degree and has completed a state-approved program for teacher licensure. Currently, there's 2 states, Colorado and Utah, that have passed the legislation to join, and 15 states are now considering it through their legislatures now. And so once 10 states officially join, the compact will go into effect. This could also be game-changing as we look at mobility, especially related to the post-pandemic, labor market, and making it easier for teachers to have reciprocity as they move around. But still, I do think we still should consider looking at meaningful requirements and other ways to prove teachers' effectiveness and have a bar, because the licensure exams are not reliable consistently enough to help us get to our goal.
Mayme, could you talk about this? Because, the pushback would be that we know that students of color and low-income students are the most likely to get emergency certified teachers, the least prepared teachers. So how do we think about this in a way that also protects the students we care most about? And someone asked in the questions, what's the research saying? As Tequilla noted, we have some research showing that passing some of these tests is related to some better student outcomes, but we don't have enough. And so Mayme, could you address this?
Absolutely. I agree with Tequilla entirely here. I think the tests that we have now, the certification exams that we have now, predict very little to nothing about students' experiences in those teachers' classrooms, students' academic outcomes in those teachers' classrooms. And so to me, when you have a test that's expensive and that's disproportionately a barrier to teachers of color, that predicts very little to nothing about what matters for kids, why would you be using that as the major gateway into a profession, particularly when you have a shortage? And I think that there is actually a solution here. It's one that's going to require us to invest even more in the profession, but it's one that we use in other professions, and it's called residency. Use a year for the aspiring teacher or the paraprofessional or the teacher's assistant or the parent coordinator, folks who have a stated interest in and commitment to education, have a year where they're learning what it means to be a teacher of record, where they're getting great preparation alongside that year of apprenticeship in the classroom. And at the end of that year, make a higher up decision into teacher of record status. Right? It's performance on the job that matters most in this field, like so many other fields. And it's actually performance on the job that is the singular most predictive factor about what future performance on the job will look like. So give people a year of support, apprenticeship, and preparation, and then decide along with them whether this is the right long-term professional pathway or not. That would be my proposal for how everybody enters the profession, not the yay or nay on the tests that predict very little or nothing at the front end.
I completely agree with Mayme. I see our students blossom over that year, and their capacity and what they've learned as instructional practitioners is amazing. So in my eyes, at Tech, we tried a competency-based model for a year. I thought our students did a terrific job in creating a portfolio at the end of their residency that highlighted all of the things that they really thought were their strengths about teaching. And I think for them, that experience was way more meaningful than the dollars that they spent to go in and, you know, perform on a multiple choice or constructive response test. It just, it gave them the ownership of that experience, but it also allowed them to highlight themselves in a way that really was a reflective demonstration of what they learned throughout that year. So I couldn't agree more with what
and you know, someone asked in the questions if there are institutions of higher ed and teacher prep programs who get it in terms of the preparation and graduation candidates of color. And I do want to point out that NCTQ, the National Council of Teacher Quality, did look at the passing rates on exams and found a number of institutions like Texas Tech, like Relay, that have gotten passing rates that don't differ by race. So having teacher prep programs actually takes some responsibility, as you mentioned, Tami, for filling in content gaps also is important. You know, I want to go now to this question of hiring practices, because even once candidates pass a licensure exam, we've seen some evidence that there may be discrimination at the point of hiring. We also know that human resource departments have often hired on a sort of passive basis as opposed to actively going out and recruiting candidates of color. How should districts be rethinking their hiring practices to ensure they have an adequate pool of candidates of color?
I mean, the first step, it sounds like a no-brainer, Lynn, but it's actually having a very explicit stated goal and naming this as a priority. I mean, when I led talent in Memphis, this was a stated priority for us. And in those states that have made traction in this area, it's where they have named it through policy and funded legislation, not another unfunded mandate, but through policy and funded practices to have clear measurable goals and give districts access to, you know, resources, toolkits, and strategies that actually help them implement on the ground. And so rather than seeing it as like this intractable problem, acknowledging that, hey, this is our lived reality and leaning into those solutions. One example, Arkansas recently, you know, they posted a very clear numeric goal to increase the number of teachers of colors in public schools by 25% by the year 2025. They've posted it on their website. They've made it a mandate. They're working with their districts. Another place you may have seen, people may have seen recently, Mississippi, similar has, and Tennessee. Like, so it's interesting, several, and these are just a couple, right, just where I live in the deep South, but have all set explicit goals around there. And you're seeing even like at the district level, there was an NPR story featuring Jackson, Mississippi's, their Grow Your Own program, where they're naming it as a priority. They're reaching college grads earlier and lifting up these efforts to try to do it. And so that's why I say, like, first naming it as a goal, being clear about where you are. We actually published a report called Broken Pipeline, because the truth of the matter is that 80% of our teachers still come through traditional ed prep programs. And so most of these programs are state funded. We need to do more in holding them accountable to increasing and prioritizing the diversity of their programs. So asking those questions, paying attention to the data, and making it very transparent, both at the state level and at the district level, because to your point, those practices that are keeping people out happen all along the way. And if districts are prioritizing that in the community and board are holding the district accountable, that's how we'll start to see traction there. The last thing I did want to say, I know one person, I saw one question in the chat about like sort of a galvanized efforts. And I wanted to mention a campaign we do have going. It's called Million Teachers of Color. And what that is basically a collaboration. It's the acknowledgement. When we did the math, we calculated that assuming we hold true that all of the teachers in the profession now stay, all the teachers of color.
Mhm.
If in 10 years we wanted to close the gap between student and teacher demographics, we would need to add approximately 1 million new teachers of color. Like, that's a very specific and bold number that no one organization alone can reach. And so that's one of the places where some of our organizations are starting to come together to collaborate, share strategies, share best practices.
Yeah, and everything that Tequilla laid out. I think also when we hear about professional learning opportunities, it's often school focused, teachers and principals. I would extend that to HR and talent as well. And like, what is their professional development opportunities, growth plans, and trajectories to make sure that they're also really analyzing, and of course, as Tequilla laid out, like, you got to have goals, but then also just seeing like, how are they matching towards that? How are they supporting schools? And then what are people's experiences with HR? Am I experiencing something in my school or in the HR process? And am I giving that feedback? Am I being told like, oh, you're just being overly sensitive? Oh, they didn't mean it, right? Like, are they doing that? Or is it taken seriously? And are we looking at, okay, how are biases actually weeding people out that really should be leading classrooms and schools for that matter?
Yeah, Mayme, you looked like you were going to jump in at one point on this question. Do you have
I'm
anything
just
to add?
nodding emphatically.
I know that some of the districts I talk to, it's not only setting goals, it's having very clear data that you're holding yourself accountable to, moving up hiring dates, giving preferential access to schools with high percentages of minority students to actually fill hard to staff positions. And to your point, Sharif, really making sure that those who are engaged in the hiring process, whether they're from central office or teachers at a school level, really understand and are conscious of both explicit and implicit bias as they go through this. I'm also curious, Sharif, once teachers of color get into the classroom, what are you hearing from people about what their experiences are actually like, and where there might be a gap between sort of creating environments that would make them want to stay and what they're actually experiencing on the job?
Yes, no, absolutely. And it varies, but one of the things that seems consistent is that many schools, while they're recruiting, districts are recruiting, they're not prepared to actually support teachers of color. They're not prepared to support educators with varied backgrounds. And just as we see consistently that teachers from traditional programs, say that they're not ready to teach, and particularly students of color, it's the same. That parallels with leadership teams. Even the principals that we spoke to, we say like, how are you thinking about retaining teachers? Many of them, were really flabbergasted even about the question, like, retention, like, we're just trying to get them in, and we're like, okay, but what type of ecosystem and environment and culture are you inviting people into? And are they coming in the front door and leaving out the back door? I mean, we were so perplexed that, with our colleagues at the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium, we ended up just developing a teacher retention toolkit, specifically for retaining educators of color. And initially we were asked to do this for principals, and we refused. We said, we will not do this for principals. We'll design this toolkit for leadership teams, which includes the principals and also principal supervisors, who could now have something to develop. Because many principals said they were never, developed to and giving, opportunities to learn how to lead a leadership team. It was just this assumption, as you grow in leadership responsibilities, how to lead a leadership team. And then secondly, they had really no ideas as far as like, well, how do we, support teachers of color? So I'm a, huge fan of, some of the reports that came out prior with like Ed Trust and Teach Plus of, one, if you listen, we will stay, right? Like that's that's one. Just, the idea of listening and being proactive and getting feedback about people's experiences in your school, in your district, and whether that's from the time that they enter all the way through as they're embarking on their career. And so being able to do that is incredibly important. And I think, many teachers of color, we see higher attrition rates.
Mhm.
And we often talk about it as three things. And it was mentioned earlier, the idea that they may be experiencing racial biases from their colleagues and supervisors. It's triggering memories that they had as students, or maybe even young before they had the language for it, because we know there's research that shows, Black and brown children experience their teachers' racial biases as early as 3 or 4 years old. So I'm experiencing now as a professional. I remember experiencing something like this where I didn't feel like my full humanity was respected and honored as a student. But now I'm in a position of leadership in my own classroom and trying to protect students who look like me so that they don't. That's pretty heavy. And that's before we get into lesson planning, grading, research, community, relationship building, knowing where the best time to run to the bathroom. All those things happen afterwards, right? And so many of colleagues and supervisors are absolutely oblivious to the actual experience within their schools and districts. And this is why it's so important for communication, relationship building, but also asking, how are you experiencing my leadership? What can I start, stop, and continue doing? And that is the responsibility of leadership teams, both at school and district levels.
And, we also know from the data that teachers of color are actually more likely to go teach in hard to staff schools, which themselves have additional stresses or under-resourced, may have higher turnover in leadership and other things that sort of can cause people to exit the profession prematurely.
That's where our children are. That's where, our community's children are. And so, yes, we're attracted to that, and it exacerbates all the challenges that we are, discussing already.
And Mayme, Sharif talked about leadership. What's your own perspective on the role of leaders in terms of retaining a diverse teaching force, and what's Relay's experience been with that?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree, Sharif, with what you're saying. And school leaders make all the difference, right? It's the old adage, you don't quit your job, you quit your boss. You don't stay in your job, you stay for your boss. And so the boss in the school is the principal, right? And who that boss is really matters. And for teachers of color, great to have a boss who they can see themselves in, right? 56% of our school leaders in our Relay programs are leaders of color. But whether you're talking about leaders of color or white leaders, folks need to demonstrate their commitment to creating a school culture that honors diversity, that creates equity, that creates inclusion. To Sharif's point, a colleague of mine said the other day, school is the scene of too many crimes against kids of color. And those kids of color grow up to be teachers of color and leaders of color. And all leaders need to make it clear that our school, this place is not going to be the scene of the crime. This is going to be an equitable, inclusive space for our kids and for our teachers. And I think often when we talk about creating equitable or inclusive environments in schools, we're talking about the K-12 students in those schools, as we rightly should be. We also need to be talking about creating equitable, inclusive cultures for the teachers in those schools. And I think that's part of what we focus on in our leadership preparation programs at Relay. And I think that's part of what many of my colleagues here focus on in their programs with leaders. And I think that needs to be a larger part of the conversation. What are the conditions for your teachers, specifically your teachers of color in the school that you are leading? Last thing I'll say on this is, I had a white principal very early in my career, 20 plus years ago, who told me flat out that he prioritized hiring teachers of color. And that was the first time I'd ever heard anyone say that. And it made a huge impression on me as a white teacher that has really shaped the way I see the workforce since then. I think we had more people being clear, to Quilla's point, about what is the goal, who are we prioritizing, and how. It would make a huge difference.
We have a question too about where can districts' HR teams look for equity-focused professional learning opportunities?
Yeah, I'll put a couple.
Are there regional partners recommend?
Yeah, there are. I'll have one of my staff members try to put it in the chat. We have some resources around some things that we've, how we go about training HR professionals to look at implicit bias, explicit bias, some of the where the policies themselves may be problematic, where the language may be problematic. So we can put some resources in the chat for folks, because we've actually put together some kind of practical toolkits that we call to help them. So we'll put some of those in the chat.
And Tami, as your program works with districts, I know that you actually have sort of regular meetings with principals in those districts and the coordinators around students' experiences. Can you talk a little about sort of how does that work, and how does that help address some of the issues that Sharif and Mayme and Tequilla have mentioned?
So I think one of the things that we've learned throughout this process is, in order to ensure that teachers have a quality experience in this one-year residency, we have to engage not only school principals, but district leaders in conversations about what those experiences should look and sound like. We've been really intentional about meeting with them, communicating with them, and being very transparent about the needs of a cohort and what those students' experiences should look and sound like, so that we want to create opportunities where they're in Title I schools serving the students that have the highest needs, but also that they're getting to know the district through the campus principals and what they're able to create in terms of culture. And I think, to everyone's point here this morning, I don't think that the residency program model would be as effective without having solid partnerships with our districts. Those meetings and opportunities to communicate and collaborate have provided us with a lot of information, not only on how to provide a quality residency model, but also on the hiring practices that would make it much easier for students to become a part of that district. We make sure that the districts are 100% involved from the beginning of the student's experience to the end, so that that it's a seamless process for them, where they're able to not only have access to HR people, but to know exactly what they're looking for throughout that entire process. They're in as much a part of the students completing our one-year program as the folks at the EPP. So I think that that partnership, that development of those relationships with districts and principals has been a critical factor in making sure that our residents have a quality experience, but also that they want to stay in the districts that they're working in. And I'm grateful to those district partners for being open and willing to let us in and let us peek behind the curtain and see exactly what they're doing and how we can work together to make sure that those students have an experience that they'll not only remember, but they'll learn from.
And people have put a number of great resources in the chat, both perspectives of teachers of color and leaders of color about what needs to change, and also resources for best practices. Tequilla, TNTP recently came out with a report looking at last hired, first fired policies and its impact on teachers of color. And it's an issue we haven't talked about yet, but I'm hoping in these last few minutes you can talk about it, because we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot when we create policies to increase the number of teachers of color who are hired, and then because they are most recently hired, they also end up being the first laid off.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. And then I'll try to be really quick on this, but the reason it's so important now, LIFO, these last in, first out policies, this is not a new issue, but the reason it's so really critical now is because as districts are facing declining enrollment, They're facing, the cliff of ESSER and stimulus dollars, and then just our broader, economic macro level trends. It's likely that districts' budgets are going to see some hits. And that means that the districts will be forced to likely, lay off some of their teachers that they've been able to add during these last couple of years, given the, being flush with COVID dollars. Most districts, too many, have last in, first out practices, which means that teachers who are last in are the first fired. Unfortunately, what we found in our research is that in most districts, it's not an equitable policy. Nearly every state, early career teachers are more likely to identify as teachers of color, and that means that they're going to be let go where the policy relies most heavily on seniority. Now, we're not saying that experience doesn't matter. We're not saying, oh, get rid of seniority at all. We're saying it should be one tool that districts look at experience, that districts and states are using to look at how to, looking at layoffs if they have to. Many of our strongest teachers, we even know that some states and districts where their teacher of the year have lost their jobs because of these LIFO policies. So it's not only harming students, it's damaging the whole quality of the teaching profession when your teacher of the year is laid off simply because of a policy that only relies on seniority without looking at the broader context. There are other factors that can be considered. And so in the paper we recently published, and we'll make it available so all students thrive, we published it with E4E, Educators for Excellence. It actually highlights some of the other variables and other things and factors that districts and states can look at in addition to seniority, to look at how to make layoff decisions in a way that's far more equitable, that may likely do less harm disproportionately to teachers of color.
And going back to the licensing issue, we did have a question. What are your thoughts on universal testing requirements for teaching licensure across all states so that it is more portable? And what about using portfolio submissions instead of praxis? And anybody can jump in here.
Well, I'd love for teacher licensure to be more portable. To Tequilla's point, I'm excited about this interstate mobility compact. I think that's great for teachers in so many ways. And, if there were a licensing exam that really predicted significantly things about kids' learning outcomes, things about kids' experiences in schools, I would be for it. I just haven't seen it yet. So until I see it, I feel firmly that we need to find another way because we don't have that licensing exam now, universal or otherwise, that really predicts what we care about for kids.
And what about portfolio systems like EdTPA? Because that was the second part of the question. What do folks think about these portfolio systems?
And so our students had a positive experience with it. I mean, I think it challenged our faculty in some ways and trying to changing how they think about preparing students. But at the same time, I think we grew from that experience too. It highlighted opportunities for us as an EPP to consider a different way of thinking about educator prep and making sure that students not only had the methodology and pedagogy to be successful, but they also could communicate that in a way that highlighted what their skills are. And so I'm on board for portfolio-based assessments because it really does put the student on display and not their ability to color in a bubble or match what the correct response would be. It really highlights what they've learned over their time in their EPP.
And I know we're at time and I want to thank you all so much, but if anyone has a last takeaway thought you would like to leave listeners with, please jump in.
My last one, the teacher shortage. This is not just about warm bodies. We have to be focused on having enough quality, diverse teachers, and educator diversity is an under-leveraged resource that we all should be pushing forward to help solve our nation's problems. This is not just a K-12 problem.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with that, and really, it's going to be a coalitions in those cities, states, and regions that turn the tide on this. And I would really challenge school and district leaders to, as they're developing recruitment plans, ensure that they have a comprehensive retention plan, because that's ultimately is the best will graduate college, to start looking at them as talent. Again, start earlier, engage high school youth invite them into helping to solve a problem they had no hand in creating.
Agreed. I just want to say how much I've learned from the folks on this screen over now a couple decades in this profession, and from the programs that you all are running. And so I'm grateful for that experience, because for many reasons, but Sharif, to your point, it's going to take a coalition to move the needle on high quality preparation for teachers, ensuring we're bringing in a more diverse group to the profession, ensure that we're getting the raises and other compensation changes that our teachers deserve. It's going to be all of us. It's going to take all of us.
And I'll just agree with Mayme. This has been a terrific experience for me as well. I'm very appreciative to hear from such great minds. And it's very encouraging too, because it pushes us towards thinking about what future possibilities could be. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And thank those in the audience who sent us some great questions.